get started, Tony and Mike have lots of good materials to share with us tonight, and we want to give all of our time to the session. If you haven't been here before, I know some of you said you had watched the online version, and this is the third in our series of We Are Beargrass, We Are Disciples. Our goals, as you can see on this slide, both deeper understanding of the Disciples of Christ commitment and our Beargrass worship, grow, serve mission statement, and to better understand our roots and evolvement as a church and a denomination, which is going to be the focus tonight. Okay, we have had excellent sessions led by Kevin DeCoste in January. And here in February, we have tonight's Understanding Our Roots with Mike Puckett and Tony Newberry. Everybody, I'm sure, knows that Mike is the author of our wonderful historical book about Beargrass. And Tony is a historian by profession, I guess, and degree. So we have their great expertise in talking about the history of disciples and the history of Beargrass and the evolvement of both. Tonight, we have another session in February. Kevin will be back with us for session 4. And then Chris Rexstraw will begin our March session on March the 3rd. And we have our panel discussion on the 13th, and our field trip, Tony may talk a little bit more about this, to Cane Ridge is set and ready to go for May the 1st. And we have one more, is that the last slide? That's it. So I give you Tony and Mike.
So one of the things we're going to be doing, a little bit of a tag team, including passing the mic back and forth. Pass the mic to Mike, and he's going to pass it to me. We'll see how. I'm sure it'll go just fine. So Donna said that I'm a historian. Maybe 40 years ago I was. I earned a doctorate in history, and then went into community college administration. But I've always maintained a strong avocational interest in history, and I love the history of Kentucky, and particularly the history of the Stone Campbell movement and Beargrass. This session is the first of 2 sessions that are going to include a lot of history of Beargrass and the Stone Campbell movement. The other will be the trip to Cane Ridge on May the 1st. A little bit more about that later. So our goal today really is to increase the understanding of what it means to be a member of Beargrass and the disciples of Christ. And Mike and I want to honor the heritage of our church and honor the generations of disciples and others as we've gathered in. Catholics and I'm a Methodist, my wife's a Presbyterian. You know, we are a community, a broad community, but now we are disciples of Christ. And so we're going to be reviewing a few of the major developments in the, get this, 238-year story of our church. Now, we're only 180 years old if you go back to when, and Mike will tell you about this, that Christmas Eve service in 1842 when we made that transition from Beargrass Baptist to Beargrass Christian. So, but it's, many, many decades, and you can make a case for more than 200 years. So the focus today is going to be on the history of Beargrass, and then from time to time we will add in the broader developments that the history of Beargrass is a part of, in fact is central to. So we're going to be highlighting some of those selected developments in the history of Beargrass. And of course, as Trey said today in both services, Mike has written the history of Beargrass. He is the historian, and so we're going to take full advantage of him and that wonderful book that he's written, which will be the historical framework. And then there'll be from time to time where we'll talk about broader developments. So questions are welcomed at any time. It's going to be a serious challenge we've talked about to cover everything in in about 70 or 75 minutes. But as Mike told me this week, he says it's a little bit like speed reading through a couple of centuries in Beargrass and Disciples' history. We know we can do it. So here goes. We're going to start with Mike.
Thanks, Tony. Well, this is my opinion, but I think our church has, to sort of play off the words that Trey used in the sermon today, has an extraordinary history. There are intersections with our nation's and our state's history. There are confluences with Louisville and St. Matthew's history, as well as the Disciples of Christ as a denomination. So, yeah, so we're going to speed through dates and names and places and try to put some significant markers in front of you and give you some context as best we can in this short time. I always ask people to try to emphasize, because dates and names, all this can be very dry. History can be to some people, and everybody, Tony and I realize, doesn't love history the way we might. You know, just think about the ordinary people like you and me who might have been here in 1784 or 1842 or 1900, whenever it was. So it's ordinary people like us that come together for an extraordinary 238-year history of this church and its predecessors. There's some handouts as you came in, so hopefully you got those, 5 or 6 pieces of paper. And they have some key dates just as a takeaway for you. The actual documents we have from Beargrass begin with a membership book in 1842 when we became a Christian church. They're very fragile at this point. Had to wrestle them from the Disciples Historical Society in Bethany, West Virginia, when I said about updating our history. So these are like membership books with just names. And then you get into a period where there are 3 of these from 1884 to about the 1948, I think the third one is, where the minutes of meetings are handwritten. So it's all handwritten. So with these, we can start to actually hear some of the history come alive. The rest we sort of have to put in the context of what's going on in the general area and in the community, and I give great credit to David Whitaker, who did the original research of our history. He did a book in 1967. This was the first published history of Beargrass, and so there was no internet like I got to use. He had to do all this research, whether it was at the courthouse or on the ground somewhere. 25 years later, in 1992, Don Tolles updated it, and he sort of dropped David's history into this book and added 25 years to it. And so both those gentlemen were journalists who worked at the Courier, and then I did this one 5 years ago. To make things a little bit easier in thinking about 238 years, some time ago I sort of broke it down for my own purposes for talking about these 4 eras. Era 1 is the original Beargrass Baptist, which was from 1784 to 1842. Then the little country church era, which is when Beargrass was here in a completely rural environment for those 75 years, and in 1917 to 97 when it became a suburban church because St. Matthew's became a suburb of Louisville. So that's the way we'll sort of approach it here today, starting with Era 1. Sort of want to set the stage for you what was going on, because all of you aren't from Louisville, I realize. We have international visitors, so in 1784, when, going back to the 1770s actually, and a little bit before, the Revolution, American Revolution, was raging, and the frontier is moving beyond the 13 colonies west across the Appalachian Mountains. Kentucky was first explored by Daniel Boone, He was here as early as 1767, coming out through the mountains out of North Carolina. And he carved out at some point, he was paid to do this actually, carved out Wilderness Road, which helped people. And of course, he didn't discover the Cumberland Gap, but when he found that someone had, that made the trips into Kentucky a lot easier across the mountains. 1778, George Rogers Clark, who was then Lieutenant Colonel Clark, came down the river with a force of military during the war, and they couldn't go beyond the falls, so they landed at Corn Island, which is no longer there because it sunk in subsequent years. But 16 or 18 cabins went up on Corn Island. That was the beginning of Louisville, which was then named Louisville 2 years after that. Out here in the hinterlands of Louisville, George Floyd came along and put up the first fort, which is over here not far from Brown Park. And then there were 5 more. They sort of stretched from Lynn Station Road to the corner of Cannons Lane and Lexington Road. So there were 6 of them when they were all put up in that 2 or 3 year period. And that became known as Beargrass Settlement. And those were built where there were springs so that they had water inside them. And so 6 of those along a 5 to 10 mile stretch of property, not just in a straight line necessarily. Then religion came to the frontier. Baptist Reverend John Whitaker arrived from Maryland in 1780, and he first established Severns Valley Baptist Church in what is now E-Town. It wasn't then, but that's where it was established. And then within a couple of years, Methodist, Presbyterians, and Catholic contingencies followed, the Catholics ending up in Bardstown primarily. So Whitaker then moved from down around where E-Town is today to this area, and he got the folks together along the Beargrass settlement, those 6 forts, and along with James Smith, formed Beargrass Baptist Church, our predecessor. There were 19 members originally. They probably worshiped outside and in the homes of the folks who lived in the settlement when it was cold. Then a man named George Hikes, Senior, came to the area in 1790 and became prominent in that church. He bought 400 acres. That's who Hikes Point is named for. And sometime, we don't have any written record of this, but sometime between 1798 and 1809, there was what they called then a stone meeting house put up somewhere in the rear of where Shelbyville Road Plaza is today. And we know it was 1809 at least by then because there was a deed transfer for an acre of property. They then bought a 2nd acre sometime after that. Just to give you an idea of what Louisville looked like, 1784, there were, remember, Clark landed 1778. 6 years later, there were 100 cabins down on the river and 63 houses. And so all this happened with Beargrass Baptist before Kentucky achieved statehood, which was 1792. Also in 1792, the first church in Louisville proper was built at 12th and Main streets, and it had different congregations flowing through it, different denominations. The population of Louisville, not out here, the population of just Louisville was 600. The population of Beargrass Settlement was probably about the same at that time. So, Tony?
All right. Well, it's kind of amazing to think that the history of this church precedes the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, Washington becoming president. As Mike said, it happened before Kentucky's admittance as a state. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the beginnings of the Stone Campbell movement. It happened several years before the Cane Ridge Revival, which was one of the founding events with the Stone Campbell movement. Now, my challenge here in about 10 minutes is to try to give you a concise overview of the broader development of the Stone Campbell churches. And Beargrass was right at the center of that story, as you will see, but I'm going to going to try and, Donna has been working with me especially to try to keep things concise, and this is the one piece that goes over about 3 or 4 minutes. So y'all bear with me a little bit. And my excuse is that there is so much written on the Stone Campbell movement. This is something, one of our Bibles, this is an encyclopedia that was created by about 30 historians who have written more than 300 books total. So I'm going to give you the concise version, and hopefully it'll contribute to your understanding and appreciation. So Kentucky in the 1780s and 1790s was, according to the traveling preachers of the day, and we've got a lot of their memoirs, was a spiritual wasteland. The population of the state in the 1790 census was 73,000. By 1800, it was 220,000, so the state was growing very rapidly. And yet, according to the preachers, a lot of them were Methodist circuit riders. Fewer than 1 in 10 on the frontier professed affiliation with any church. Now, Beargrass was one of the exceptions. There was Beargrass Church, there was South Elkhorn, there was Cane Ridge had been established in 1791, but churches were not the common, they were not on every corner, to put it mildly. Lexington, according to Francis Asbury, who was a circuit rider and a later bishop of the Methodist Church, was, quote, a rogue's harbor of vice and infidelity. And there was another circuit rider by the name of Peter Cartwright, who remembered, he lived until almost the Civil War, and he wrote this delightful autobiography. He remembered that Louisville was a brawling river town, rife with the spirit of speculation and boosterism. You could find more whiskey than you could find religion in Louisville during that time. So the spiritual situation was such that the ministers and the faithful felt the need for a revival. And in 1799 and again in 1800, a Presbyterian minister who moved from North Carolina by the name of James McGrady began holding communal gatherings. Within the Presbyterian tradition, there's this concept of communal gatherings, which would go on for days. And so that became the basis of some significant revivals in Logan County on the Gasper River, near present-day Russellville, near Bowling Green. There were revivals in the summer of 1799 and again in 1800. And among those who attended was a young Presbyterian minister named Barton Stone, who had been converted by McGrady while in North Carolina. So Stone knew McGrady, McGrady knew Stone, and Stone was very impressed when he went to one of those revivals about the spontaneous demonstrations of the Spirit. He was a little skeptical about that kind of emotion. He had a kind of a rationalist approach to accepting, to studying the gospel, but he saw that it made a difference. And so he and McGrady and other ministers decided to hold a revival at Cane Ridge, north of Lexington, in August of 1801. One historian has called the Cane Ridge Revival America's Pentecost. It was some event. It occurred over eight days, the second week and into the middle of August of 1801. There were at least 12,000 participants. That's about the most modest estimate that you can get, and some of the estimates were as many as 25,000. Now Lexington's population at that time was 2,500. So almost 10 times the population of Lexington was out there on the ridge at Cane Ridge. There were 23 preachers, 18 of them Presbyterians, including Barton Stone, 5 additional Baptists and Methodists, and the scene was 5 to 7 sermons going on simultaneously in various parts of that location. Stone's autobiography paints a very vivid picture of the spiritual fervor that characterized the revival. He had analyzed it in his rational way, and he identified 7 exercises: dancing, laughing, singing, falling, rolling, and his autobiography devotes a couple of pages to each of these, and then even spontaneous jerking and barking. I mean, it was a big event, 12,000 people, 5 to 7 preachings going on at once. Now the success of the revival energized young ministers like Barton Stone, but there was still a lot of skepticism, particularly among the traditional Presbyterian clergy. This was the beginning of the so-called Second Great Awakening. In the 1730s and 40s, there had been a Great Awakening on the East Coast, and it had split the Presbyterians into groups that were called simply Old Lights and New Lights. The Old Lights were traditional in their approach. They were Calvinists to the core. They really clung to the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is about a 400-page description of what you believed if you're a Presbyterian. The Revivalists, though, didn't really stick with all that, particularly the Calvinist piece of it. So the revival concept that salvation is available to all who are willing to repent of their sins and accept Christ as Lord and Savior ran counter to the traditional Calvinist view that fallen men and women could not attain salvation on their own. The Old Light Presbyterians believed that only God's grace, his sometimes inscrutable grace, could accomplish that. And as John Calvin had taught, only an elect few were predestined to receive it. So, but now you've got this whole cadre of ministers who are supporting the revival approach to building the churches, and it led to conflict, not only with Barton Stone, but 5 other ministers who were part of the Presbyterian Synod of Kentucky, who were called on the carpet. They were administered, they were admonished, they were censured, and once they were censured, these 6 ministers, 5 plus Barton Stone, decided, well, we're just not going to have any of that. We're going to form our own presbytery, which they did. It was so-called Springfield Presbytery. We're going to carve out our own territory. We're still Presbyterians. But after a few months, they realized that they were just contributing to the problem, the way they saw it, the problem being divisions and party spirit, all kinds of arguments that were really run against the spirit of unity. That was the essence of Christ and the Bible. So within just a few months of creating the Presbytery, they got together and they said, let's kill this thing. And so they created a document called the Last Will and Testament of the Springfield Presbytery that is one of the 2 founding documents of the Stone Campbell movement. We'll talk about the other one briefly in just a minute. This was a document that rejected the authority of any church body beyond the congregation. And the 6 ministers declared that we will that this body, the Springfield Presbytery, die, be dissolved, and sink into union with the body of Christ at large. These ministers, they rejected any denominational names, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and declared that henceforth they would accept no other name than Christians, which according to Acts 11:26 was the first name given to the followers of Christ. And one of the ironies here is that of those 6 ministers, 3 got caught up in the fervor of the Shaker movement, which came to Kentucky in these decades, and 2 went back to the Presbyterians, and that left only Barton Stone, who pushed forward with his concept of a church that would avoid the divisions, which he thought were and many of his revival-oriented ministers were the plague of Christianity. So meanwhile, I just skipped the meanwhile, okay? Another Presbyterian preacher by the name of Thomas Campbell in western Pennsylvania and northwestern Ohio had moved from Ireland. He'd been trained at the University of Edinburgh. He had a 20-year career in Northern Ireland, where he was continually locked into conflict with a lot of divisions. We think today of Catholics versus Protestants, but in Northern Ireland at that time, it was big divisions within the Presbyterian Church. In part to escape that, at the age of 42, he migrated to America. A year and a half later, his family came. But he set down his roots in western Pennsylvania, where he thought he was far enough away from the traditional controllers of the Presbyterian Church to be able to operate on his own. But he had all kinds of clashes. It was reported to the Philadelphia Synod and the church that he was practicing open communion. bring everybody to the table. He disputed with some aspects of the Westminster Confession. And so the result was that they actually hauled him to Philadelphia. They had a trial. They booted him out. They revoked his license to preach. And with that was born the Campbell churches in the West. He struck out on his own. He formed with Campbell, he formed these alliances, these very practical alliances, pragmatic alliances with the Baptist associations. He believed in adult baptism, baptism by immersion, and that was enough that he could work with the Baptists. They brought he and first his Brush Run Church and all the other churches that he planted into the Baptists, and that was the way it operated for about 30 years. In 1809, Thomas Campbell wrote the Declaration of an Address. That's the second founding document of the Stone Campbell movement, and along with the last will and testament. And in that address, it's a very hefty tome, but it was very inspiring to many people. He laid out 13 propositions which he believed would serve as a platform for church unity and a pathway for restoring the purity and simplicity of first century Christianity. Now, interestingly, his son, who was 20 at the time, Alexander, was able to read a proof copy of the Declaration as his father was drafting it. It affected him powerfully, and 2 years later, he was ordained into the ministry, not the Presbyterian. He was ordained by his father in the churches that the Campbells were establishing. And Alexander Campbell was a force to be reckoned with. As he moved into his late 20s and his 30s and his 40s, he became one of the best known speakers in America. And we won't go into his whole biography, but suffice it to say that between Thomas Campbell and Alexander Campbell, and then in the 1820s, a talented evangelist by the name of Walter Scott, the Campbell movement really set ablaze the western Pennsylvania, northwestern Virginia at the time, and Ohio. Now, I think you all know where this is leading, because eventually the Campbells could not be contained in Ohio, and Alexander Campbell made tours of a number of upper South states, including Kentucky. He came to Kentucky in 1824, and as Mike will tell you, he visited Beargrass. That shows you the centrality of Beargrass in this whole story. But he also sat down and had conversations with Barton Stone. They had, both of them published these newsletters, we would call them today, but they were not only preachers, but they were prolific writers. And they would publish and circulate their writings. They became aware of each other and the similarity in some of their ideas, but also they disputed a lot of each other's fine points. So in 1824, the two sat down to discuss their differences and beliefs, and they determined that they were spiritual brothers. And there were a number of ideas, and there were handouts back on the table that kind of go into more detail about this, but things that they agreed upon: scriptures alone, no creed but Christ, no book but the Bible. Christ died for all, rejecting Calvin's emphasis on predestination. Unity among all Christians. Alexander Campbell had a phrase that he often used: in faith, unity, in opinion, liberty, in all things, charity. In other words, don't dispute the little things, let's agree on the essentials. And there's kind of a debate among historians about that, that's similar to something that apparently St. Augustine said back in the 4th century. But Alexander Campbell modified that to suit this movement: restoration of New Testament Christianity, congregational governance, weekly communion, and then believers' baptism. Now, Stone and Campbell had a little bit different view of how important it was, how essential it was to have adult baptism. Stone generally recognized folks coming from the Methodist and the Presbyterian and the sprinkling traditions, but Campbell did not. But they were essentially in agreement. 8 years later, they still disputed. There's a mass of of exchange in writing between the two over the finer points of theology. But by the early 30s, they agreed to bring their movements together, and there was this famous meeting. This is a picture of a stained glass window that you can see when you go to Cane Ridge. It's a beautiful window. And Campbell was not there, Barton Stone was, but Campbell's representative, John Smith, made a very famous statement. And I love this statement because it's so simple, so straightforward. It kind of gives you the essence of the Stone-Campbell movement at this point. Excuse me. While there is but one faith, there may be 10,000 opinions. And hence, if Christians are ever to be one, they must be one in faith and not in opinions. Let us then be no longer Campbellites or Stonites, New Lights or Old Lights, but let us come to the Bible, and the Bible alone is the only book in creation that will give us all the light we need. And so that's 100 mile an hour, probably more than 10-minute review of the beginnings of the Stone-Campbell movement. And I'll end by simply showing you upper right, you've got the Cane Ridge Church. It actually survived into the 20th century. It's the way it looked before the building on the left was built in the 50s. A lot of folks got together out of the Stone-Campbell movement and built this wonderful facility over top of the original church. You can go there. There are a lot of services there all the time. And so one of the things that Donna and Mike and I want to do is invite you, May the 1st, to go with us up to Cane Ridge and to hear the story of Cane Ridge and the Stone-Campbell movement.
Thanks, Tony. So, Tony portrayed there how things happened, excuse me, with the Presbyterians. That's nothing to how it went with the Baptists a little bit later down the road. So, I think something important to remember as we're thinking about Stone and Campbell too, is we're in an era where there's no telephone, no radio, no TV. Things only moved as fast as you could walk it to the next place or take it by horseback. And so things moved slowly, and each of these gentlemen, Stone and Campbell, had a newsletter. And so a lot of their debates went back and forth in those newsletters before they finally got together. One was the Baptist Christian or Christian Baptist, one was a Christian Messenger. John, you may recall, but I always confuse which one had which. But so that's the bigger picture, disciples. Now let me sort of bring you back a little bit to local history. A key person in the founding, as we moved from Beargrass Baptist and one other church I'll talk about in a moment, a key figure was a young minister named Benjamin Allen. And should comment just a little bit too, ministers are also much different, just like telecommunications were very different 200 plus years ago. Most churches either had an elder preaching on Sunday in those days, or they had a bivocational preacher, so either a farmer or a carpenter or something, who came and preached on Sunday. And so, so very different than the church world as we know it. But a man named William Keller had begun Harrods Creek Baptist Church, which is the oldest church in Oldham County. And he took in young Benjamin Allen when he was 12 years old. Keller was a cabinet maker. And he took in Allen, who started to apprentice under him. And obviously he did the same in the ministry. So when Allen is 30 years old, which is 1817, Keller dies suddenly, and he took over the preaching duties at Harrods Creek. And in the succeeding 2 decades, so this is 1817 into the 1830s, Allen provided preaching service, as it's called, to many local Baptist churches. In addition to Harrods Creek, Flat Rock, Floyd's Fork, and Beargrass Baptist. Now in 1803, there were also collections of Baptist churches that came together in associations, and so they would have conferences. There was something called Beargrass Baptist joined in 1803, the Long Run Baptist Association. And when things when Campbell started to come to this area, as Tony just outlined, he started to have followers from western Pennsylvania and through what's now West Virginia into Kentucky and surrounding states. And so one of the people that started to subscribe to the things he preached was this young Benjamin Allen. And there were several of these Baptist churches that I mentioned were part of this long-run association. Well, in 1829, Allen begins two more churches, one at Ponds Creek, which is around the old New Jefferson County line, and another called Goose Creek, which is very prevalent in Beargrass Christian's history. So that was 1829, just hold on to the dates. So 1832, the same year that on New Year's Day, Stone and Campbell's groups came together in Lexington, he applies for membership in Long Run for these two new churches, Goose Creek and Ponds Creek. And because they didn't believe in creeds, the association rejected their membership. And that caused Campbell to pull out the other church, or Allen to pull out the other churches. So he was really crossways with the local Baptist. And from that point forward, he began to help congregations. And the way this would happen, sometimes people would leave the Baptist church, sometimes entire congregations, entire churches would move over. And so he helped facilitate several different Christian churches coming into being that were following the tenets of Stone and Campbell. Newburgh Christian, I think we have someone in our Sunday school class who used to go to Newburgh Christian, was formed in like 1937. Allen helped that, facilitated that. Then J-Town Christian, he was involved in helping start, which is still there. Both of these churches are still functioning today. But he died also in 1838 at the age of 51. But by that time, he had sort of set the folks at both Goose Creek and Beargrass Baptist on this mission to form their own church. And so in 1842, we get to the point, there's a flurry of activity. The Beargrass Baptist trustees sold the 2 acres that they had down here behind what is now Shelby Road Plaza. And then 10 days later, August 9, there were 5 trustees. 2 of them were sons of George Hikes. They buy property at 4164 Westport Road, which is on the corner right opposite Target across Thurman Lane. So that was where it began to come together, even though Benjamin Allen had died 3 or 4 years before. So that on December 24, no church is built yet, December 24 in 1842, there was a Christmas Eve worship service at the home of trustee and elder Alfred Hare at 4417 Westport Road. And that home is still, I think we have a picture of that home. Yes. That home is still there. It looks different, but so if you're going out Westport Road, you cross Hubbard's Lane, past Target, it's about halfway to the Watterson Expressway. So it's way back on the left. This is the time of year you can actually see it. It's so far back that when the foliage is out, you really can't see back there. It's a long drive. And so that was where the first worship service for this church was held, in the basement, continued to be held there, the services, until they were able to build a church at the address here near Target. David Whitaker, who wrote the 1967 history, researched all of this and came up with our 88 original members, and it's kind of hard because the ink is all faded and the documents are very fragile. But we know that there was a letter from Goose Creek, which is recorded in one of our minute books. Someone recorded it later. I've never seen the original letter, if it still exists. But there were 44 members, and so the other 44 apparently came from Beargrass Baptist, and so nice symmetry there, I guess. So we have a record of how many were men, how many were women, and also at the bottom, and this becomes relevant because we're going to talk about the Civil War and that period of our history. There are 8 people listed with the word colored behind them. So they were obviously slaves working in the homes of the members of these 81 people who came together from Goose Creek and Beargrass Baptist to form the church. Just one other point, the names in the membership book, if you drive the neighborhood here, you will see their names on street signs. And so Hare, H-E-R-R, we all know Hare Lane, most of us. There were 10 Hares in those 88. There were 5 Rudys, Rudy Lane. There were 5 Arterburns, Hubbard, Finley, Oldham, and Gilman. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about Gilman in a moment. Just one other point, in the period, let's go to era 2. Yeah, so just to give you an idea, the little country church, what's happening when we get to what's happening in the broader area here. The Louisville population, as I said earlier, was 600 in 1800. By 1850, it was 43,000. Sometime around 1860, it actually passed Lexington to become the largest city in the state. And the population of Louisville was 90,000 by 1865. In this area, St. Matthews, it was completely rural and would be for decades yet when this church was born. Hemp was the first crop. Daniel and Ann Gilman arrived here in the 1830s. That's the first commercial establishment. They opened a tavern and a grocery. This area for a good while was called Gilman's or Gilman's Point. And so that was near where Westport Road comes into Chenoweth Lane. One other point about the church when it was born, 1842, the first documents refer to Beargrass as the Church of Christ at Beargrass. And sometime in the 1840s, and again, we have no record of exactly when it occurred, a church was put up at the corner by Target, and we do have a record of the first minister who was actually preaching at the church. It was in 1853. His name was William Crawford. So that's a little bit about getting us up close to the Civil War. Go ahead, Tony. I should say that if anybody has a question, sometimes I'm speaking from this, but not always. So if you see something you have a question about or something one of us says, feel free to stop us. Ron?
Your house, the old house that you had a picture of.
Yes.
Is it still, is it used? Has it been preserved?
Yes, people live in it. For a while it was called the Hare Height, H-I-T-E, Corn. So as it went through different family members. But there were 8 houses built in a 3-mile radius here by the Hares and the Rudys that are all on the National Historic Register. So you've seen some of them, you may have not known. That's one of them.
Okay.
Yes, John?
The Church of Christ at Beargrass?
Yes.
Yeah. That's still used by some Church of Christ, that way to name their church is still used today. And it's to emphasize that the church is the congregation and nothing beyond that.
Okay, thanks.
All right, about the Civil War. This is actually going to, on my part, a lot briefer than the other. But we thought that given all the discussion, everything that's going on in our society and the deep discussions that are happening in our church about passion for justice, and Chris Rakestraw's presentations that are upcoming, and that we really need to spend a little time talking about the Stone Campbell movement during the Civil War, particularly as it relates to the tensions of that war around the issue of slavery and human bondage. One historian has said that the Stone Campbell movement was born and sought to voice its plea for Christian unity in an age of increasing controversy over slavery. I mean, that was inherently difficult. The whole movement was about unity, and yet there were these tensions and issues that were just tearing the country apart, tearing communities apart, states apart, families apart. Tensions were increasing everywhere. So, interestingly though, and I'm going to get to a point that John Richardson taught me about, if you look at what happened to the Protestant churches prior to the war, the Methodists, 1844, the Baptists, 1845, and even the Presbyterian Church right on the eve of the war, those denominations split right down the middle over slavery. The disciples of Christ did not, of course they're not a denomination, that's a key point, did not have an organizational split in the years leading up to the Civil War. But as John has pointed out, the reason for this is more than likely that there was no overarching national organizational structure. Now there were mission organizations and there were meetings that occurred, but there's no governing body beyond the local congregation with the authority to argue and debate the issue. So Stone Campbell historians still debate, why did the disciples and the churches of Christ didn't split, did they? Well, no, they didn't, but what's the reason and the rationale and how significant is that? What we do know is that disciples, leaders, operating on their own, and disciples' congregations really did get involved in significant ways in the issues of the day. And just to give you a few examples, Barton Stone, right from the beginning of his ministry, expressed anti-slavery views of varying intensity. And there's a whole story about Barton Stone when he was on his way up to Cane Ridge, saw a slave market in Charleston, and it shook him to the core. But so early in his ministry, strong abolitionist stance. In these middle years of his ministry, he moved to a more moderate position and actually founded the Georgetown, Kentucky chapter of the American Colonization Society. That's a different thing from immediate, it's gradual, compensated emancipation, and the ultimate goal is to encourage enslaved peoples to move away from the United States. But then, in the latter decades of his life, he moved back to immediate abolitionism, and he continued to publish his newsletters, The Christian Messenger. In the latter decade of his life, he actually published William Lloyd Garrison's work on abolitionism, immediate abolitionism, and he exhorted his readers to free slaves or suffer imminent judgment of Christ. Twice in his life, this is so interesting, he inherited enslaved people from his mother. He inherited enslaved folks that he brought from I think it was North Carolina, and they actually lived in the vicinity of Cane Ridge until he could figure out a way to achieve their emancipation, which he did. Then later on, his second wife, mother died and left. She lived in Tennessee, had enslaved people as property, and left them not to her daughter, but to Barton Stone with the stipulation that he could not, there was a stipulation that he could not free those individuals. And he did research on it, he hired lawyers, and it had to do with the peculiarities of Kentucky law. And this is one of the main reasons that he moved to Illinois later in his life, because there, those stipulations did not obtain, and he freed those persons as well. Thomas Campbell took stands against slavery. One interesting episode is that he actually, when he visited Kentucky, Burlington, Kentucky, in 1819, he was preaching, and he was approached by some African Americans to stay the afternoon and join their Bible study. And what he found was that it was there were 100 or more African Americans, enslaved people there, ready to worship God under his leadership. What he was surprised to find out is that some of the folks that had invited him to speak to the white church in the morning weren't too happy about what he was doing, and they basically shut down the service. And he had a lot to say about that in his writings after he was disgusted, he said, at the prejudices of white Christians. Alexander Campbell, really interesting story. He was strongly anti-slavery early in his ministry. And there are various times when he, more than any other religious leader in the country, took a stand against slavery. The Virginia Constitutional Convention that occurred in the 1820s, he was a delegate to the convention because he lived in what was then, part of Virginia. He lobbied Congress in 1832, 20 years after the War of 1812. The debts had been paid off, and he had an idea for what to do with the money, and that was to set up a fund for the purchase and education and colonization of slaves. He also lobbied the 1849 Kentucky Convention, Constitutional Convention, for anti-slavery provision. So there's no doubt that he was trying to take a stand on the issue, and yet, particularly in the 1850s, when he became very concerned about what was happening to the disciples' churches under the weight of all this sectional controversy, he began to moderate his position. He continued to say that slavery is wrong, but he prioritized the unity of the churches above that issue. And the result was that he got into some really interesting controversies. One thing that is not represented on the slide, he had 3 sisters, each of whom had been involved in fighting against slavery in the Wheeling, West Virginia area. And one of those sisters wrote a long letter that was published in the Northwestern Christian publication, which the Northwest Christian magazine was headed by an anti-slavery disciple by the name of John Boggs. But at any rate, Alexander Campbell's sister took him on that issue. And it's pretty, well, I could read you the stirring letter that she wrote. But the really interesting thing, the thing that I highlighted here, and this may be something else, John, that you told me about this. Bethany College was, of course, Alexander Campbell, Thomas Alexander Campbell founded that college. It was a strong the first disciples higher education institution, the oldest in the tradition. But there were a number of students who began to, 5 or 6, who began to agitate anti-slavery views. And Alexander Campbell didn't really think that was appropriate for students. I mean, it's like a 1960s student protest pushed back to 1850. They censured the students, and then he expelled them. And what did they do? Well, there was a new disciples institution being founded about the same time in Indianapolis. The founder was Ovid Butler, and the institution would be named after him, Butler University. Ovid Butler was an anti-slavery newspaper publisher and an early Republican Party leader. And so those students found a home pretty quick in an anti-slavery hotbed in Indianapolis. So this is just giving you a sense of how the issue did animate the disciples in the Christian churches. And here are just 3 examples of individuals to illustrate the point. I love the story of Party Butler. He was a disciples minister who was so motivated by the anti-slavery cause that he went to to Kansas, bleeding Kansas. There's open warfare between slave and anti-slavery forces. And Party Butler took up arms and actually was a an officer in these paramilitary organizations, and he became a target of the pro-slavery forces. Another individual is Elizabeth Thomas Tubman, a different kind of a story. She and her husband was they were very wealthy, and when her husband died, she had talked to him about what to do with all this wealth. And she was from Lexington originally and had lived in Georgia. But basically they liquidated most of their property, or she did, and she purchased the freedom of 140 slaves in Georgia and also in Kentucky. Now, lest you think all the disciples were anti-slavery, there's the example of James Shannon, who was one of the slavery's a good thing folks that were in the South. James Shannon was the president of Bacone College, which, if you stretch things a little bit, is a predecessor of the College of the Bible and LTS. You have to stretch a little bit because that's a very kind of a crowded, complex history there. But he was president of Bacone College, which is based in Harrodsburg, 10 years, 1840 to 1850. And during that time, and then later as the president of the University of Missouri, and then still later as the president of Culver Stockton College, he wrote all kinds of tracts, made all kinds of defenses of slavery, and I've got some quotes here, but I'll spare you those quotes right now. So
when did Trancey become affiliated with Disciples? Because I thought it would have been older than Bethany. Trancey was.
yeah,
As a college.
right. Now, I'm not an expert in any way on the origins of LTS, but I do know that Bacone College went to close down. There had been this prior history with Transylvania University and then Kentucky University, and then
Right.
and what was happening during this period, particularly during the wars with the federal legislation funding land-grant colleges. That's when it became.
Because I thought UK was the College of Ag out of Trancey, and the LTS was the College of the Bible, hence its name out of Trancey. So, and then they all split.
I am sure you were right.
I don't know. No, I didn't want me to say that.
No, it's true. That's why I said it's a bit of a stretch to say that Bacone College is a predecessor of LTS, but there was apparently some property that was foreclosed on and then transferred up there. But anyway, I don't know that we want to claim the legacy of James Shannon, who was the president.
Thanks, Helen.
The Culver Stockton College is also a disciple school.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Obviously, the positions of people and that were prominent in the Stone Campbell movement are well documented. What's not documented is anything about Beargrass, its leanings as a church, as a congregation. But I think we can make some assumptions, and that's because none of these things that are in our historical documents speak to that. But I do want to just tee up a few things about this general area at the time of the Civil War, and I think from that we can make some fairly valid assumptions. In 1860, in the 1860 census, there were 61,000 whites in the Louisville community. Didn't include St. Matthews. There were about 5,000 slaves, and there were close to another 2,000 freed African Americans. And so that's just sort of hold those numbers.
So Mike, you said there was, I've forgotten the number, how many that had colored beside their name. How do we know that they were slaves and not free?
Well, we don't, for sure. We don't. But I think this was 1842, so they didn't have last names. I think that's a pretty good.
Okay.
So actually, Whitaker gave them last names of the people's houses they were living in, and so our historian. So it's not 100% sure one way or the other, but I think that's, and I think so. I'm going to be making a few assumptions as we go forward just because of the local community. Lincoln did not win the vote in Louisville in 1860. John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party. And Lincoln favored at that time, and his position about slavery evolved, as most of you know, but he favored no slaves in new territories, but he hadn't gotten to the point of freeing the slaves in his own mind. And then there was a Democratic candidate, John Breckinridge, in 1860. He was pro-slavery. So Lincoln didn't win the vote. Lincoln also lost the vote in Louisville in the 1864 election. And there were many historians think that that was because of the 1863 passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so McClellan actually won the election here in 1864. I guess the point is, everything says that the local landscape was very divided, as Tony's pointed out, even with our Stone Campbell predecessors. But this area was very divided on the issue of slavery. If we look at St. Matthew's or Beargrass Christian Church history that we do know, there are some signs of division. None of it is documented, written down anywhere, but we know it was the most divided time in our history. William Wallace Hare, another Hare, Senior, served as a Confederate drill master. He married Kitty Todd, who was a sister to Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham's wife. Actually, Mary Todd Lincoln had 3 brothers who served in the Confederacy. Some were killed, I think. So even within Lincoln's own family, his in-laws, there were people on each side. Thomas Bullitt of the Oxmoor Bullets, he and his brother enlisted in the Confederacy. While their neighbor, Robert Anderson, who was born out about Hurstburn at Soldiers Retreat, Hurstburn and Shelbyville Road, he actually headed up the Union troops at Fort Sumter when the Confederacy first fired on them. And he was brought home pretty quickly after that. But you know, within a stone's throw of each other, there are the Bullets and the Andersons. One's in the Union Army, and the 2 brothers are in the Confederate Army. There are Confederate Confederate leanings, signals in some of the, talking about the local folks. Within Beargrass, Henrietta Ormsby wedded a Union general during the war, Walter Whitaker. So I think it's safe to say that this area had deep sentiments for the Union because we stayed neutral as a state, at least. But the area had deep sentiments for the Union, but there were also many closely aligned with the Confederate causes. So we have to believe the area was very divided, so there's no reason to believe our church was not very divided as well. Just to sort of switch directions coming out of the Civil War, St. Matthew's remained farmland until the early 1900s, but the railroad coming out of the war had been built out, and this area started to change with the railroad. Farming moved from hemp alone to vegetables, especially potatoes, onions, and a rail station here gave rise to, or gave farmers a way to get their products to market. The first commercial establishment in St. Matthew's, this general area, all still rural, was Nan's Craft. It was called Nan's Nooner at the time, or Noonan. That was in the 1870s, so that's how old that company is. It goes back to the 1870s. At Beargrass in 1881, there were 75 people on the rolls. 25 of them were either Hares or Arterburns. So 1/3 of the congregation were from 2 families. The large landowning families were the ones that continued to worship at Beargrass, and that includes the Ormsby and Winchester families. Another thing that happened in the 1880s for this church was that we were one of 5 churches that joined together to establish something called the Christian Widows and Orphans Home. So this is 17, 18 years after the end of the Civil War, and that organization is known today as Christian Care Communities.
You didn't mention that first bullet up there. How did that play out? What was
Oh, sorry,
women's
sorry,
greater
Leslie.
Apologize harder than.
I just didn't know if there was a thing in particular that women did.
Well, it's in the disciples overall. There began to be, women began to be ordained. Yeah.
You get discounts on the railroad if you're ordained.
Do what?
You get a discounted ticket on the railroads if you were ordained.
Maybe that's the one that didn't get it.
Quite possible. Yeah. So, now just a quick snapshot, and y'all are skeptical when I say quick, I know. But in terms of the broader developments, this is an era between the Civil War and the early 20th century when there are major developments within the Stone Campbell movement. There are divisions, there are differences, and just to give you a sense of that, I wanted to, I've been reading a book that's written by historians from the perspective of the churches of Christ as opposed to the disciples. Now, why do I say as opposed? Because there are differences there. And it's very interesting to me to see how historians of the churches of Christ describe this period. And there are just two brief paragraphs that come from this book by Gary Holloway and Douglas Foster. After the Civil War is the picture that they're drawing. After the Civil War, many disciples' churches in the prosperous northern cities became successful in society. They built large buildings with expensive stained glass. They preferred educated members. They could even afford expensive organs for their new buildings. The disciples in the North became so accepted in the culture that one of their number, James A. Garfield, became president of the United States. By contrast, Southern members faced starvation, disease, and economic ruin. What they're trying to do here is to reflect the feelings that were established during the Civil War period that later on were expressed in other kinds of division. By contrast, Southern members faced starvation, disease, and economic ruin. To Southerners, it was inconceivable that their fellow Christians in the North could spend money on buildings and organs while their brothers and sisters in the South were just struggling to stay alive. And so what they're trying to do is point a picture that there were regional differences in society at large, but it really kind of racked the community of disciples in Christian churches. Socioeconomic differences, there's been studies showing big urban-rural divide developing, affluence and poverty. You can't go too far with that, but you have to keep that in mind. 2/3 of the disciples' congregations by 1900 were in the Midwest and the border South. States with the largest disciples membership: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee. 2/3 of the churches of Christ were located in the states of the Confederacy. And in addition to the socioeconomic differences, and this is something that would rely on our ministers, but some of the differences in worship and church organization that became very conspicuous during this period were, for example, the debate over instrumental music. Churches of Christ tended to say that the scriptures were silent, were explicit on the need for singing, but silent on musical instruments. And even though Stone and Campbell said where the scriptures are silent, there ought to be liberty, churches of Christ often said, no, we think that's a prohibition. And organization of missionary societies was another one. Disciples' congregations tended to support these broad-based mission groups like the American Christian Missionary Society and the Christian Women's Board of Mission, which was established in 1870 in Cincinnati. Again, the scriptures are silent on these multi-congregational organizations, and Church of Christ editors like Talbot Fannin tended to denounce them and argued for, yes, missions are important, but it needs to be sponsored sponsoring congregations, not these big mammoth multi-state organizations. Professional ministries was another point of debate. Disciples were early supporters of educational institutions. There was Bethany College, there was Butler University in Indianapolis, the College of the Bible in Lexington, all of which have roots before and during the Civil War era. Churches of Christ.
1865, as they say, out of the ashes of the Civil War, in LDS.
Yeah. The Churches of Christ, and John, correct me on this, but it seemed that they tended to wait a little longer. I mean, there were great institutions like Lipscomb, which was founded in 1891, and Abilene Christian in 1906. I know there's more to the story, but these are just examples of some of the issues that begin to divide the Churches of Christ from the disciples. There were debates over Sunday schools. Disciples tended to move that direction. There was a debate I was amazed to learn about over whether you could use multiple cups of communion or not. Again, the scriptures. And then lots of big debates that would build on the interpretation of the Bible. And of course, there was the big, huge issue at LTS in 1917, which is a whole topic in and of itself. So the bottom line is that 1906 was the first ever U.S. census of religion, and at that juncture, of course, the divisions had already happened decades before, but the disciples, the Church of Christ congregations and the leaders opted to declare themselves separate from the disciples. And these were some of the statistics: about 160,000 Churches of Christ. This is membership, not individual congregations, and nearly a million disciples. And then over the next decades, the Churches of Christ would grow rapidly to nearly 435,000 by 1926 and 600,000. But the disciples were also growing, not rapidly but steadily during this period, up to, and this may be the peak, I'm not sure, but it was, there's a figure from 1948 where there were 1.7 million members of the disciples' congregations, and the later figures that I've seen tend to be lower than that, so I think there was some leveling out here. But that's just a snapshot of a huge division within the family of the Stone Campbell churches.
I think one of the real ironies is, as you go through the last half of the 1800s and then on into this century, as I studied Beargrass history, and it's involved with the Stone Campbell movement, is the theme of unity and how these ununifying things kept happening. Like the Church of Christ, and then that is propelled more in the 20th century. But just a few things in the early 1900s. It was an important, critical time. Beargrass had two church structures over on Westport Road. The first was a brick structure, and somewhere in here we may have seen a picture of in 1888, a second structure was built. We don't know what happened to the first one. I don't have a picture of it. And that's where the term Little Country Church comes from, because it was out in the rural hinterlands of east of Louisville. In 1900, the Louisville population by this time was a couple 100,000, and the community through the interurban lines was starting to move out to neighborhoods. As we said before, the Gilmans had been here. Nan's Nooner was here. Their St. Matthew's Produce Exchange developed because of the rail, and 13 million potatoes were shipped out in 1920 out of that exchange cooperative. But in 1906, a very important couple came to St. Matthew's. Gilbert Dick was a banker, helped open the St. Matthew's Bank. So it was the first bank in St. Matthew's. His wife was Winnie Dick. She was equally important to Beargrass. And they bought a house right across Brown's Lane, wherever we are here, right across Brown's Lane. And so lots of things for the church took place there, because by 1912, 1914, there began to be some discussion of potentially moving the church. And a lot of it had to do, this was called the Shelby or Shelbyville Pike out here, the Frankfurt Pike, so there began to be some discussion that a better location would be here on the Shelby Pike than over on Westport Road. And so lots of discussions took place. The minister at that time was Reverend William Tharp, and the first board chair was elected in 1916. Until then, it had just been rotating elders had led the board meetings. But William Winchester was elected in 1916 and would go on to serve for another 13 or 14 years. But one of the important things to remember is, as Beargrass is thinking about moving and making the decision to do that, Europe is engaged in the Great War already, 1914, 1915, 16, and America is being pulled into that. So we built a new church. In April of 1917, the U.S. entered World War I, and 2 months later, we had a day-long celebration dedicating the first church on this corner, which faced on the diagonal toward the intersection of Brown's Lane and Shelbyville Road.
One of the vendors at the farmer's market says he was baptized in this church.
Who said?
One of the vendors at the, he's the guy who has his son in the business with him, and they make, the journalists make wooden bowls and all of that. But he was telling me this past summer that he was and he was describing what it looked like on the inside of that sanctuary looked like. And I just didn't think he was quite old enough to be baptized before 1951, but maybe so. But that's he.
It was 105 years ago when the church opened its doors on this corner. So.
But 1951, when the new sanctuary was opened.
No.
I don't want to.
No, that's a little before. 1958.
58.
Yeah. Actually, pardon?
I said that maybe he could have.
Yeah, he could have been.
Yeah.
It would have been the old building.
Yeah.
So, so we get to the third era, because the population of Louisville, because of the advent of the automobile and all these things, is moving the population east and south. And in the first 18 months of locating here, 30 new members. 1918, the committee structure was put in place, which is still in place today, 100 plus years later. All kinds of things were happening. The 18th Amendment, which is prohibition of liquor, and the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, finally. And so lots of things happening at the end of that second decade of the 20th century. Change was going on throughout St. Matthews. Housing clusters were popping up, different developers that lived this way, different commercial establishments. The first newspaper, the St. Matthews Booster, appeared in 1925. Plains Bakery opened in 1923 or 24, still here. Masonic Home Campus was built out. And just to hit on some, I guess, significant things in the 20s, 30s, there were always, when you read through our minutes, there are always financial shortfalls. It was sort of a way of life with this church. It was still going on in the 1920s. Reverend Tharp left the church, but in 1930, we adopted the Disciples of Christ pension plan, which had been put in place just a year or two before, and it's been sustained for our ministers. It's been sustained throughout. But the next big thing beyond building the new church here in 1917 that happened was in 1931. It's a little bit mysterious how it happened, but Walter Lawrenson had migrated from Alabama, where he grew up, to Transylvania, and then was at the, I guess it was the College of the Bible still at that point, late 20s, early 30s. But he had taken a student minister's position at J-Town, and somebody from Beargrass went out and talked to him. There was a vote by the board and then a vote by the congregation, and they called Walter Lawrence to ministry here. Things really changed for Beargrass. He had several touchstones. One was the faith of youth. He was responsible for the Boy Scout. We had a Boy Scout Sunday today. It didn't happen for a few years, but 1943, so next year our affiliation with Scout Troop 115 will be 80 years old. And I think we can attribute that to Walter Lawrenson. His biggest thing, and the stories that when I came to Beargrass, it still revolved around Lawrenson, were his relentless evangelism. Somebody would visit on Sunday, he'd show up at their house the next morning. And so just within the past week, somebody was talking to Bertha Glenn, and she said they visited she and Bob in 1954. Next morning, he was a traveling salesman, was off on the road, and Lawrenson and Van Nostrand showed up at the door, and she said, "Well, can I cook you breakfast?" And Van Nostrand said, "Sure." And so that was the day after their first visit, and so they joined pretty quickly. But he was here 4 decades almost, just a couple of years short of it, and left a tremendous legacy. Another significant thing that happened about that time was that while the rural landowning families that we've talked about from the pioneer and frontier days, who were always here, the Hares, the Rudys, and so on, other names began to pop up in these minutes. So the church congregation was getting far more widespread. People like Winnie Dick, Lois Akers, talking about females, Leslie, Mary Nick Clark, Carolyn Barth, Sue Etzcorn, a lot of the names, because they were really doing all the work at the church except for what the ministers did. And James Nolan, Hugh Cardwell, so the church was broadening its base. As I looked at the history, it was pretty phenomenal. The things that really launched Beargrass into what the writer of this history, David Whitaker, called the beginning of the modern era, was when Lawrenson came. But the two things which really propelled Beargrass to what it became as a suburban church were the move here in 1917 and the hiring of Dr. Lawrenson, or Reverend Lawrenson, in 1931. We're getting close on time, so but all kinds of things. I mean, when you think about what Lawrenson, within the first decade, the church membership had tripled. The numbers were being built, the programs were being built, the financial situation was improving. This was in the age of 1917, World War I, 1929-30, the Depression. When he came, it was we were in the height of the Depression, and right on into then the first half of the 40s of World War II. So what he achieved here really was monumental. So in 1942, we celebrated our first 100 years as a Stone Campbell church. Sunday school classes, the first two had been formed in 1924, the Gleaners, which was all female, and the men's class, which was all men, and became the men's Bible class at some point. In the 1940s, other Sunday school classes popped up. One which would become Round Robin, it was called the couples class at the time. So, and that was another thing that was a focus of Reverend Lawrenson. He knew that small group and Bible study were very important to the development of the congregation. In 1939 and 1949, there were expansions. The first one in 39 was to the rear and double the size of that 1917 sanctuary. And then to the southeast side, that way I guess, there was another expansion in 1949. But when the church really blossomed was as we got into the 50s, as the greatest generation came home from the war and became very active. So the population of Louisville was 630,000 in 1950. Lots of things happened in this city: Waterston Expressway, the opening of Kentucky Ferry and Exposition Center, opening of GE's Appliance Park, which would become the biggest employer for a period of time, and St. Matthew's Incorporated. So I'll just give you one other name here before we move out of Beargrass history. Jim Nolan Senior. There's a picture of him in the book. He came in 1929. Reverend Lawrence attributed the sound financial management, which would then, once you're through those years, before Lawrence came, when we got on sound footing and sound financial principles were put in place, Lawrence attributed that to Jim Nolan. He was one of 3 people who helped incorporate St. Matthew's, which started with 3 blocks on the north side of the tracks at Chenoweth Lane, but that was 1950. By 1954, it had reached 4th class status. And Jim Nolan was the mayor, had no salary for the first 8 years of St. Matthew's. He was rumored to have paid people's utility bills, paid his own expenses. So obviously a wonderful human being, and served without salary for those first 8 years to 1958. Just a couple things. 1950, you may not know that Beargrass opened the Beargrass Christian Church Nursery and Kindergarten, and it functioned for 25 years until 1975. That first class, 1950, there were 36 students.
Did Berkeley Glenn start that?
She came a little bit after. I think they came to here in 1954, and it started in 1950, but she was there for a number of years because she was a teacher, and it always had professionals working in it. 1953, Will Van Nostrand was hired. He was not the first second minister we had, but we became a 2-minister church a couple of years before that. And even today, he served 40 years, so he's the longest serving Beargrass minister ever, 1953 to 1993. He'd grown up in New Jersey and came down to become LTS if it wasn't already. And also has a wonderful legacy. So really, the Beargrass history for about 60 to 70% of the 20th century was dominated by Lawrence and Van Nostrand, and I mean dominated in a good way. They were prominent in leading this church, and so eventually in the early 60s, Lawrence had a second heart attack, and Van Nostrand took on the preaching duties, and so I think I'll stop there. And
In fact, we probably.
Yeah.
I mean, as you might imagine, there's still a lot of history to talk about, particularly leading up to 1968, when the disciples of Christ pretty much dropped the notion that we are not a denomination. And there's a whole story there that we could tell at another time, and there are folks here who could add to it. I think the point that I would make is that Beargrass, in that transition to 1968 and the grand design and the adoption of all those core documents and foundation documents like the preamble and the covenant, Beargrass was very much involved in that. In fact, in 1960, there was a international, the convention was here. The whole denomination came together, and at that point, there was a restructure committee that was established, and Beargrass co-hosted that meeting, and then you can go on through, and this is an important story for another time, but Beargrass was prominently involved in the Kansas City meeting in 1968. Reverend Van Nostrand was on the board at that time, and then a little later on, Dr. Dale Fears, this was June of 1971, who had been one of the architects of the restructure and was general minister, came to Beargrass to speak, and then that October, Beargrass again second time in 11 years, hosted the international convention. And the quick point is that Beargrass was all in on the restructure, was very involved, and that's a significant development in the history of the Stone Campbell churches. So I wish we had more time, but Mike, thank you so much for taking us through the history of Beargrass Church. It really is a special place.
Yeah, any final questions?
Yeah,
I guess?
other questions?
I guess the one thing on the 1958 is when we actually took on the name Beargrass Christian Church Disciples of Christ. That came out of the International Convention, 1958. And then 1968 is when we formally became a denomination. So just those two things, 10 years apart. So yeah, it is an extraordinary story. I think you can't give it justice in a few minutes, but there's so much deep history, so many people that walked through the doors of whatever this church looked like. I will tell you that the campus today has nothing left of the 1917 structure. So the last portions of the 1917 structure came down when the current education building, this part of the church, was built in 1992. So they'd been used for educational space up because the sanctuary had been replaced in 1958, which was what's now Charles Hall. Don?
You might add that you guys chose to kind of stop at 1968 because you felt like the material that Kevin has been sharing with us takes place from that point forward.
Right. Thank you.
And thank you all so much. They could have spoken for 2 weeks solid on the materials.
Mike, somebody says the wood entrance, and I don't know if it's the door too, but the entrance to the chapel, where is that from?
I'd have to go back and read my book because I've lost track, but it was from the 1917 structure, I believe. Yeah. There's also a communion set right out here outside the office. It was donated to the church by those Hares and Rudies in 1869. So it's, when they, like the Episcopalians, all drink out of one cup, or Ron did growing up as a Catholic. There was one stick. Yeah, there are some, but yes, that little table that sits outside was a communion table from the prior church, yes. Well, thank you all for listening. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.